Some places hold secrets that defy every law of physics we understand. They sit quietly on the edge of towns, unremarkable and forgettable, until something happens that forces us to question the very nature of reality itself. The Chevron station on Route 47 outside of Bakersfield, California, was one of those places. For 23 years, it had been nothing more than a convenient stop for truckers and travelers crossing the desert. Fluorescent lights humming over gas pumps, a small convenience store with overpriced snacks, and a single storage room in the back where employees kept inventory and took their breaks. On the night of October 18, 2019, 3 men walked into that storage room during their overnight shift. None of them ever walked out. The police investigation that followed would involve local authorities, state investigators, the FBI, and eventually theoretical physicists trying to explain what the security footage showed. Because what happened that night wasn't just impossible, it was a documented impossibility, captured on multiple cameras, with no rational explanation that satisfied the evidence. My name is Detective Sarah Chen, and I've worked major crimes for the Kern County Sheriff's Department for 14 years. I've investigated murders, kidnappings, organized crime operations, and cases so disturbing they still wake me up at night. But nothing in my career prepared me for what happened at that gas station. Nothing in anyone's career could have. This is the complete account of the Route 47 disappearances, documented from witness statements, security footage, forensic evidence, and the personal histories of 3 men who vanished from a locked room with only one exit. A room that security cameras watched continuously. A room where the laws of physics apparently stopped applying for reasons we still don't fully understand. Before I explain what happened that night, you need to understand who these men were. Because in the investigation that followed, we looked for any clue, any pattern, any reason why 3 specific individuals might have been targeted or chosen for whatever occurred. We built detailed profiles of their lives in the weeks leading up to their disappearance, searching for warning signs we might have missed. Marcus Reed was 32 years old, the senior employee at the gas station, and the closest thing the night shift had to a supervisor. He'd worked there for 6 years, consistently taking the overnight shifts because the pay differential helped support his family. Marcus had a wife, Teresa, and 2 daughters aged 7 and 9. He was studying online for an associate degree in business management, hoping eventually to move into a better-paying job. Everyone who knew Marcus described him as reliable, steady, and devoted to his family. He didn't drink, didn't do drugs, attended church most Sundays when his work schedule allowed. His co-workers said he was quiet but friendly, the kind of guy who did his job without complaint and helped others when they needed it. In the 2 weeks before he disappeared, Teresa noticed nothing unusual about Marcus's behavior. He came home from his shifts at 7 in the morning, slept until mid-afternoon, spent time with his daughters, had dinner with the family, and headed back to work at 10:30 each night. His routine never varied. He seemed neither anxious nor excited, neither depressed nor unusually happy. He was just Marcus, steady and predictable as always. The only thing Teresa remembered as potentially significant was a comment Marcus made 3 days before he vanished. They'd been watching a documentary about space exploration, and Marcus had said something about how scientists were starting to think there might be multiple dimensions existing alongside ours, universes we couldn't see or detect but that were just as real as our own. Teresa had asked why he was interested in that kind of thing, and Marcus shrugged and said he'd been reading about it online, that quantum physics was fascinating once you got into it. She thought nothing of it at the time. Marcus read about all sorts of topics when he had downtime at the gas station. History, science, philosophy. It was just how he kept his mind occupied during the long, quiet hours of the night shift. But after he disappeared, that comment took on new significance. Why had Marcus suddenly become interested in multiple dimensions and quantum physics? Had he somehow known what was about to happen? Or was it just coincidence, the kind of random detail that seems meaningful only in hindsight? The second man was David Cho, 26 years old, who'd been working at the gas station for about 18 months. David was different from Marcus in almost every way. Where Marcus was settled and family-oriented, David was restless and always talking about his plans to leave Bakersfield. He worked the night shift because it left his days free to work on his real passion, which was music production. David had a home studio in his apartment where he made electronic music, beats and ambient soundscapes that he uploaded to streaming platforms. He had a modest following online, a few thousand people who listened to his tracks, and he dreamed of eventually making enough from his music to quit the gas station job. David's roommate, a guy named Kyle, who I interviewed extensively after the disappearance, said David had been acting strange in the week before he vanished. Not dramatically different, but subtly off in ways that were hard to define. David had always been talkative and energetic, but in that final week he'd become quieter, more introspective. He spent more time in his room with the door closed. Kyle heard him on long phone calls late in the afternoon before his shifts, though he couldn't make out what was being discussed. When Kyle asked if everything was okay, David said he was fine, just thinking about some deep stuff lately. He'd been experimenting with meditation and lucid dreaming, trying to expand his consciousness and get inspiration for his music. Kyle didn't think much of it. David was always trying new things, new creative processes, new ways of looking at the world. That's what made him interesting to be around. But there was one conversation that Kyle remembered clearly, one that haunted him after David disappeared. It was 2 days before the incident, and David had come home from his shift at 7 in the morning, looking exhausted but also strangely energized. He'd told Kyle about a book he'd been reading, something about the nature of consciousness and reality. David had been excited, talking rapidly about how scientists were discovering that consciousness might not be produced by the brain, but rather received by it, like a radio picking up signals that exist independently. He said reality might be far more fluid and malleable than we assume, that there might be ways to shift between different states of existence if you knew how. Kyle had listened politely but hadn't really engaged with the ideas. It sounded like the kind of stoner philosophy people discuss at 3 in the morning, interesting but ultimately not practical or relevant to daily life. Now Kyle wished he'd paid more attention, asked more questions, tried to understand what David was really talking about. The third man was James Whitmore, 24 years old, the newest member of the night shift crew. He'd only been working at the gas station for 5 months, and his co-workers didn't know him as well as they knew each other. James was quiet and kept to himself most of the time, doing his work competently but not engaging in much conversation beyond what was necessary. He lived alone in a small apartment, had no close family in the area, and seemed to prefer solitude to socializing. What his co-workers didn't know, what we only discovered during the investigation, was that James had a history of drug use. Not hard drugs, but he was heavily into psychedelics, mushrooms, LSD, DMT. His apartment, when we searched it after he disappeared, contained an extensive library of books about consciousness expansion, shamanic practices, and the nature of reality. His computer browsing history showed he spent hours on forums dedicated to discussing psychedelic experiences and theories about parallel dimensions and alternate realities. James kept a journal, handwritten in notebooks that we found stacked on his desk. The entries from the months before his disappearance showed a progression of thinking that started as curiosity and evolved into something approaching obsession. He wrote about his experiences with DMT, a powerful psychedelic that produces intense but short-lived effects. James described encountering what he called entities or beings during his trips, intelligences that seemed to exist in dimensions adjacent to our own. He wrote that these entities had communicated with him, though not in words exactly, more like direct transmission of concepts and feelings. According to his journal, these entities had told him that the boundaries between dimensions were thinner in some places than others, that certain locations and certain states of consciousness could allow for crossing between worlds. James had become convinced that finding these thin places was possible, that with the right preparation and the right mindset, a person could shift from one dimension to another while remaining fully conscious and aware. His final journal entry, dated October 16th, 2 days before the disappearance, was brief and cryptic. He wrote, "I think I found one. The place I've been looking for. It's been there the whole time, hiding in plain sight. Tomorrow night, I'll know for sure." We didn't know what that meant, not at first. But as we pieced together the timeline and the evidence, a disturbing picture began to emerge. James hadn't just been interested in these ideas theoretically. He'd been actively searching for a location where the barriers between dimensions might be weak. And apparently, He believed he'd found it at the gas station where he worked. The night shift at the Route 47 Chevron ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. Marcus, David, and James worked this shift together 4 nights a week, Tuesday through Friday. Their duties were straightforward: pump gas for the occasional customer, stock shelves, clean, handle the register, and make sure nothing went wrong during the quiet hours when traffic was minimal. The gas station sat on a long, empty stretch of desert highway. During the day it was moderately busy, but at night it could go hours without a single customer. The 3 men had plenty of downtime, which they spent reading, watching videos on their phones, or talking when conversation arose. The gas station had a comprehensive security system installed 2 years earlier after a robbery attempt. 8 cameras covered different areas, 2 outside watching the gas pumps from different angles, 1 pointed at the front entrance, 1 covering the interior of the store and the register area, 1 in the back office, 1 watching the rear entrance and loading area, and 2 in the storage room. The storage room cameras were positioned to cover both the entrance and the interior space where inventory was kept. Every camera fed into a digital recording system that stored footage for 30 days before overwriting. The system was reliable and had never malfunctioned in the 2 years since installation. October 18, 2019 was a Friday night, the last shift of the work week for Marcus, David, and James. The evening started normally according to the security footage. Marcus arrived first at 10:45, 15 minutes before the shift officially started. He unlocked the store, turned on all the lights, checked that everything was in order from the previous shift. David arrived at 10:52, parking his beat-up Honda Civic next to Marcus's truck. They exchanged greetings visible on camera but not audible, as the system didn't record sound. James showed up at 11:03, a few minutes late as he often was. The 3 men gathered briefly at the register, presumably discussing how they'd divide the night's responsibilities, then dispersed to their tasks. For the first 3 hours, nothing unusual appeared on any camera. Marcus spent most of his time at the register, handling the handful of customers who stopped for gas or snacks. David worked on restocking shelves, moving between the storage room and the store floor. James cleaned, mopping floors and wiping down surfaces. Their movements and interactions appeared completely normal, identical to countless other overnight shifts they'd worked. At 2:17 in the morning, the patterns changed slightly. James approached Marcus at the register, and they had a conversation that lasted about 4 minutes. We couldn't hear what was said, but their body language suggested James was explaining something while Marcus listened with what appeared to be skepticism or confusion. At one point, Marcus shook his head, but James continued talking, gesturing as if trying to convince Marcus of something. Eventually, Marcus shrugged in a way that suggested he was willing to go along with whatever James was proposing, even if he didn't fully understand or agree with it. James then went to find David, who was in the storage room organizing inventory. Another conversation ensued, this one lasting about 6 minutes. David's body language showed more engagement than Marcus had displayed. He asked questions, nodded, at one point laughed as if James had said something amusing. By the end of the conversation, David seemed to be on board with whatever was being discussed. At 2:31 in the morning, all 3 men gathered at the register area. They talked for another few minutes, then Marcus locked the front door of the store and flipped the sign to closed. This wasn't completely unusual. During very quiet overnight periods, employees sometimes locked up temporarily if they needed to do inventory or restocking that required all hands. The assumption was that customers were rare enough at this hour that closing for 30 or 40 minutes wouldn't cause problems. At 2:34 in the morning, Marcus, David, and James walked together toward the back of the store. The camera covering the interior showed them moving past the refrigerated section, past the coffee machines, through the door marked employees only that led to the back area. The back area consisted of a small office where the manager worked during day shifts, a bathroom, and the storage room. The storage room was approximately 20 feet by 15 feet, with metal shelving units along 3 walls holding inventory. Boxes of chips, candy, cigarettes, motor oil, and other products sold in the store. The 4th wall contained the only entrance, a standard commercial door that opened inward and had no lock on the inside. The ceiling was solid concrete, part of the building's roof structure. The floor was concrete as well, There were no windows, no vents large enough for a person to fit through, no access panels or hidden spaces. It was a completely enclosed rectangular box with one way in and one way out. The two cameras in the storage room provided complete coverage of the space. Camera 7 was mounted in the corner above the door, angled to capture anyone entering or leaving. Camera 8 was mounted on the opposite corner, covering the interior of the room and the shelving units. Between these two cameras, every square inch of the storage room was visible. There were no blind spots where someone could hide from view. At 2:35 in the morning, all three men entered the storage room. Marcus entered first, followed by David, then James, who pulled the door closed behind them. For approximately 4 minutes, nothing appeared unusual on the footage. The men stood in a rough circle in the center of the room, talking. Their body language was relaxed. David laughed at something. Marcus checked his phone. James appeared to be explaining something, moving his hands as he spoke. At 2:39 in the morning, James moved to the shelving unit on the left side of the room and began moving boxes. He pulled down several cartons of cigarettes and set them on the floor, then reached into the space behind where the boxes had been. He appeared to be feeling for something against the wall. Marcus and David watched him with what looked like curiosity. James apparently found whatever he was looking for because he nodded and gestured for the others to come closer. Marcus and David approached, leaning in to look at whatever James was indicating. This is where the footage begins to show anomalies that our technical experts could never adequately explain. At 2:40 in the morning, the image quality from both cameras in the storage room began to degrade. Not dramatically at first, just a slight fuzziness around the edges of the frame, similar to the kind of interference you might get from electromagnetic fields affecting video equipment. The degradation increased over the next 30 seconds. The image became grainier, and horizontal lines of static began appearing intermittently. The three men remained visible but less distinct, their forms slightly blurred. At 2:41 in the morning, both storage room cameras experienced simultaneous complete signal loss. The screens went black. The timestamp continued running, indicating this wasn't a power failure to the system but rather loss of input from those specific cameras. All other cameras in the gas station continued functioning normally throughout this period. The blackout lasted for exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds. During those 7 minutes, I need to emphasize what didn't happen. No one entered or exited the storage room, according to camera 7, which covered the door. We verified this by watching footage from the office camera and the rear entrance camera, both of which provided partial views of the hallway leading to the storage room. No one passed through that hallway during the blackout period. The front entrance remained locked, visible on camera, with no one entering or leaving. The rear entrance was similarly locked and monitored, with no activity. Every exit from the building was accounted for and showed no movement. At 2:48 and 43 seconds in the morning, the storage room cameras came back online. The image quality was initially poor, still showing the static and interference, but rapidly improved over about 10 seconds until picture quality returned to normal. The storage room was empty. Marcus, David, and James were gone. The boxes of cigarettes that James had moved were still on the floor where he'd left them. The shelving unit still had the gap where he'd removed them, but the three men had vanished completely. For several seconds, the cameras recorded the empty room, the harsh fluorescent lighting showing every detail of the space. Nothing moved, nothing changed. The room was simply devoid of human presence. I was called to the scene at 6:47 in the morning. A customer had arrived at the gas station around 6:15, found the front door locked but saw lights on inside. After knocking repeatedly with no response, he called the non-emergency police line to report that the station appeared to be abandoned during business hours. A patrol unit responded and found the store locked but otherwise normal. The officer's radio calls to the station went unanswered. He looked through the windows and saw no signs of disturbance, no obvious evidence of crime, but also no employees. Following protocol for a potentially dangerous situation, he called for backup before entering. I arrived as the second detective on scene, and we accessed the building using keys provided by the gas station's owner, who lived 20 miles away and arrived shortly after we did. What we found inside raised immediate red flags. The register was untouched, containing the normal amount of cash for an overnight shift. No signs of robbery or struggle. Personal belongings of the 3 employees were present. Marcus's truck keys and wallet were on the counter by the register. David's phone was in the office, plugged into a charger. James's jacket hung on a hook by the back door. But the men themselves were nowhere in the building. We searched every possible space, storage areas, the bathroom, the office, even the ceiling access panels and the narrow maintenance space under the building. Nothing. We called each man's emergency contacts and learned that none of them had come home. Their families and friends had no idea where they were and were increasingly worried as our questions made clear the men were missing. We reviewed the security footage on site, and that's when we saw something that made this a major investigation rather than a simple missing persons case. We watched 3 men enter a storage room and never exit. We watched the room sit empty while every exit from the building remained monitored and unused. The gas station owner stood beside me, his face pale, as we replayed the footage multiple times. "That's impossible," he kept saying. "There's only one door. They couldn't have left without the cameras seeing them. But they had left, or ceased to exist, or something." The storage room was empty, the men were gone, and nothing about the physics of the situation made any sense. We brought in the crime scene unit to process the storage room. They photographed every inch, dusted for fingerprints, collected trace evidence, looking for any clue about what had happened. The prints we found matched the 3 missing men, which was expected. But we also found something unusual on the wall behind where James had been reaching. There were faint marks, scratches in the paint that formed a pattern. It wasn't graffiti or damage from moving boxes. The scratches were deliberate, arranged in geometric shapes that our analysts later identified as matching certain symbols used in various mystical and occult traditions. The symbols supposedly represented thresholds or doorways between worlds. We documented these marks extensively, though at the time we had no idea if they were relevant or just random damage that we were over-interpreting in light of the disappearance. The room itself showed no structural anomalies. We brought in building inspectors who verified that the walls, floor, and ceiling were solid concrete with no hidden spaces, no access points, no way for anyone to leave the room except through the door. We tested for false walls or concealed passages. Nothing. The FBI became involved within 48 hours, as unexplained disappearances of multiple individuals can indicate kidnapping or human trafficking, both federal crimes. Special Agent Michael Torres led the FBI team, and he approached the case with methodical thoroughness. He re-interviewed everyone connected to the missing men, building detailed timelines of their activities in the weeks before they vanished. He brought in technical experts to examine the security system, looking for any evidence that the footage had been tampered with or doctored. The conclusion was unambiguous. The footage was genuine and unaltered. The system had recorded exactly what happened. 3 men had entered a room and the cameras had then malfunctioned for 7 minutes. When the cameras came back online, the men were gone. Agent Torres asked me privately what I thought had happened. I told him honestly that I had no idea. Every rational explanation I could think of required things that the evidence showed didn't occur. The men couldn't have left through the door without being seen. They couldn't have gone through the walls, floor, or ceiling, which were solid concrete. They couldn't have been hiding in the room because we'd searched every inch of it. The only possibility I could see was that somehow the security footage was wrong, that there was a period longer than 7 minutes where the cameras were non-functional, and during that time the men had escaped. But the technical analysis showed that was impossible. The system's internal logs matched the footage. The cameras had lost signal for exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds, and no more. Agent Torres brought in a physicist from Caltech, a professor named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who specialized in quantum mechanics and theoretical physics. I was skeptical about bringing in an academic scientist for what I still assumed must be a criminal case, but Torres said we needed to consider all possibilities, even ones that seemed far-fetched. Dr. Vasquez reviewed all our evidence, watched the security footage multiple times, examined the storage room personally. Then she asked us a question that seemed absurd at first. Has anyone considered that the men might not have left through space, but through something else? What else is there? I asked her. Dr. Vasquez explained that according to some interpretations of quantum mechanics and string theory, our familiar 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time might not be the complete picture of reality. There might be additional dimensions that exist perpendicular to the ones we experience, dimensions we can't directly perceive because we're confined to our particular subset of dimensional space. She drew diagrams trying to help us visualize this concept, though she admitted it was nearly impossible to truly understand higher dimensional space when you're a being limited to perceiving 3 spatial dimensions. Most of the time, these theoretical extra dimensions don't matter for practical purposes, Dr. Vasquez said. They're compactified or rolled up so small that they're only relevant at the quantum scale. But there are some theories suggesting that under very specific conditions, these dimensional boundaries might become temporarily permeable. If that happened, an object or person could slip from our dimensional space into an adjacent one. To us, they would simply vanish because they'd moved in a direction we can't perceive or follow. Agent Torres asked the obvious question, "Are you saying these men accidentally fell into another dimension?" Dr. Vasquez was careful with her response. "I'm saying that if we've eliminated all possible explanations within our normal understanding of physics, we might need to consider explanations that seem impossible but are technically allowed by our current theoretical models. The idea of people moving between dimensional spaces is speculative and unproven, but it's not completely outside the bounds of physics as we understand it." She pointed out that the electromagnetic interference visible in the footage before the cameras blacked out was consistent with some theoretical models of dimensional boundary disruption. If the fabric of space-time was somehow being distorted or torn in that location, it would create intense electromagnetic fields that would definitely interfere with electronic equipment. I asked Dr. Vasquez if there was any way to test this theory, any measurements we could take or experiments we could run to determine if something strange had happened to the dimensional structure of that storage room. She said she could bring in some specialized equipment to measure gravitational anomalies, electromagnetic field fluctuations, and other indicators that might suggest dimensional instability. But she warned us not to get our hopes up. If such an event had occurred, it was likely temporary and had already resolved itself. We'd be looking for traces of something that was already long gone. We brought Dr. Vasquez back to the gas station with her equipment 2 days after the disappearance. She spent 6 hours taking readings throughout the storage room, paying special attention to the area where James had been reaching into the shelving unit. Her instruments detected nothing unusual, no gravitational anomalies, no unusual electromagnetic signatures, no indication that the space was anything other than a normal storage room. The dimensional boundary, if it had ever been disrupted, had apparently stabilized again. Dr. Vasquez did make one observation that troubled everyone present. She noted that the scratches on the wall, the symbols James had apparently carved there, were positioned at points that corresponded to what theorists call vertices in higher dimensional geometry. If someone wanted to mark the location where dimensions intersected, these would be the logical places to do it. Whether James had somehow known this through his psychedelic experiences, or whether it was just coincidence, we couldn't determine. The investigation expanded in multiple directions as we tried to understand not just what happened, but why it happened to these 3 men at this specific location. We researched the history of the gas station and the land it was built on, looking for any unusual incidents or reports that might suggest the location was special in some way. What we found was mundane. The gas station had been built in 1996 on land that had previously been empty desert. Before that, the area had never been developed or inhabited as far as records showed. There were no reports of disappearances in the area, no local legends about strange phenomena, nothing that would have drawn attention to this particular spot. The building inspector who'd approved the original construction was long retired, but we tracked him down and asked if he remembered anything unusual about the site. He didn't, just another commercial building going up on a desert highway, no different from hundreds of others he'd inspected over his career. We investigated whether there might be natural geological features beneath the building that could explain unusual phenomena, magnetic anomalies, underground caverns, mineral deposits that might affect electromagnetic fields. Geological surveys found nothing remarkable. The area consisted of standard sedimentary rock with no unusual features. We looked into whether any of the 3 men had known each other before working together at the gas station. Marcus and James had been strangers before James was hired. David had known Marcus slightly, as they'd both lived in Bakersfield for years, but they hadn't been friends outside of work. There was no evidence of any conspiracy or planning between the 3 men. They were simply co-workers who happened to work the same shift. Except that wasn't quite true, as we discovered when we dug deeper into James Whitmore's background. James had specifically requested the overnight shift when he applied for the job. The gas station owner remembered this because most applicants preferred day shifts. James had said he needed overnight hours because of his school schedule, but we'd found no evidence he was enrolled in any educational program. He'd lied on his application about that. Why had James wanted the night shift at this specific gas station? We couldn't answer that definitively, but his journal entries suggested a possibility. In the weeks before he was hired, James had been actively searching for locations that he believed might be dimensional thin points. He'd visited dozens of places around Bakersfield and the surrounding area, mostly at night, taking measurements with equipment he'd built from instructions found online. Electromagnetic field detectors, modified cameras that supposedly could capture anomalies invisible to normal vision, instruments whose purpose we couldn't entirely determine. James's apartment contained maps marked with symbols indicating places he'd investigated. Most were crossed out, presumably meaning he'd found nothing interesting there. But one location was circled multiple times in red ink, the intersection of Route 47 and County Road 12, the exact location of the Chevron station. James had identified this spot as significant before he ever worked there. He'd then deliberately gotten hired at the gas station to gain access to the location during overnight hours when he could investigate without supervision or interruption. This suggested premeditation, but premeditation of what? Had James discovered something real about the dimensional structure of that location, or had he simply convinced himself that something special existed there? Dr. Vasquez pointed out that belief and expectation can sometimes affect quantum systems, at least according to some interpretations. The observer effect in quantum mechanics shows that the act of measurement affects the outcome of quantum events. Some physicists have speculated that consciousness and quantum mechanics might be linked in ways we don't yet understand. If that were true, and it remained highly controversial, then James's intense belief that a dimensional doorway existed at that location might have actually contributed to creating the conditions that allowed such a doorway to form. It sounded like magical thinking to me, like suggesting that wishing for something hard enough can make it real. But Dr. Vasquez insisted that, at the quantum level, reality was far stranger than our everyday experience suggested. We analyzed James's psychedelic use extensively, consulting with experts in pharmacology and consciousness research. DMT in particular produces experiences that users consistently describe as involving contact with other dimensions and non-human entities. Skeptics attribute these experiences to hallucinations created by the drug's effect on brain chemistry. But some researchers have noted the strange consistency of DMT experiences across different users. People who've never met, from different cultures and backgrounds, report remarkably similar experiences when using DMT. They describe the same kinds of entities, the same geometric patterns, the same sensation of traveling to a place that feels more real than ordinary reality. One researcher we consulted, Dr. Amanda Chen, who studied altered states of consciousness, suggested that DMT might not be creating hallucinations, but rather temporarily altering brain function in a way that allows perception of aspects of reality normally filtered out by our conscious awareness. The brain receives far more sensory data than we consciously perceive. It filters and interprets, showing us only what it determines is relevant. What if, Dr. Chen proposed, drugs like DMT temporarily disabled some of those filters, allowing perception of dimensional spaces that coexist with our own but are normally invisible to us? If that were true, James's experiments with DMT might have given him genuine information about the structure of reality, information he then used to locate the thin point at the gas station. This theory remained completely speculative and unfalsifiable, which made it frustrating from an investigative standpoint. I needed evidence I could use to find these men or determine what happened to them. Theoretical physics and consciousness research couldn't give me that. But as weeks passed and we made no progress through conventional investigative methods, I found myself returning to these strange theories because they were the only framework that made sense of the evidence we had. Agent Torres kept the case active longer than most missing persons investigations would normally justify. Usually, if adults disappear voluntarily and there's no evidence of foul play, federal resources get redirected to cases with clearer indicators of crime. But Torres was bothered by the impossibility of what the footage showed. He told me privately that in 20 years with the FBI, he'd never encountered anything he couldn't eventually explain. This case was different. Every explanation required accepting something impossible. Either the three men had left a locked room without being seen by multiple cameras, which was impossible given the camera coverage and their continuous operation, or they had somehow ceased to exist in our normal space-time, which was impossible according to our everyday understanding of how reality works. One of those impossibilities had to be true, and Torres wanted to know which. We interviewed the families repeatedly, not because we suspected them of involvement, but because we were searching for any detail that might provide insight. Teresa Reed, Marcus's wife, was cooperative but increasingly distraught as weeks turned to months with no news of her husband. She couldn't understand how Marcus could just vanish. He wasn't the kind of man who'd abandon his family or get involved in anything dangerous. He'd gone to work as he did 4 nights a week, and then he'd simply stopped existing. How was she supposed to explain that to their daughters? What was she supposed to tell them about where their father was? I had no answers for her. David Cho's roommate Kyle struggled with guilt. He kept thinking about that last conversation, about David talking excitedly about consciousness and reality being more fluid than people assumed. Kyle wondered if he should have been more concerned if David had been showing signs of mental instability that Kyle had missed, but mental illness didn't explain how David had physically vanished from a locked room. The psychiatric experts we consulted confirmed that while someone experiencing psychosis might believe strange things about reality, those beliefs wouldn't actually change the physical laws that governed their body's existence in space. James Whitmore had no close family, but we tracked down an ex-girlfriend who dated him about a year before his disappearance. She said James had always been interested in drugs and spirituality, but his interest had intensified after a particularly powerful DMT experience about 6 months before they broke up. He'd become convinced that he'd made contact with entities that existed in parallel dimensions. He'd told her these entities had shown him that reality was far more complex than humans understood, that we were like 2-dimensional beings living on a flat surface, completely unaware of the 3-dimensional space surrounding us. She'd broken up with him because his obsession with these ideas had made him difficult to be around. He'd stopped engaging with normal life, stopped caring about his job or their relationship or anything except his search for dimensional doorways. She said he'd talked about finding a place where the barriers were thin, where someone could potentially cross over if they knew how. At the time, she'd thought it was just drug-induced delusion. Now she wondered if James had actually found what he was looking for. 6 months after the disappearance, we held a press conference to appeal for any information from the public. The case had received some media attention, especially the bizarre detail about 3 men vanishing from a locked room under video surveillance. We got hundreds of tips in response to the press conference. Most were unhelpful, people claiming to have seen the missing men in various locations around California or other states. We followed up on every credible lead. None produced results. Several people called to share their own theories about what had happened. Alien abduction was popular, secret government experiments, elaborate hoax perpetrated by the men themselves for unknown reasons. Some of the theories were creative, but none were supported by evidence or explained all the facts of the case. One call did stand out, though. A woman named Patricia Mendez contacted us claiming that her brother had vanished in a similar way 7 years earlier. He'd been working as a security guard in an office building in San Francisco. One night he'd gone to check a storage room in the basement after the alarm system registered a door opening. The hallway camera showed him entering the storage room. He never came out. The door was the only exit, and the camera covered it continuously. When other guards went to investigate, they found the storage room empty. I contacted the San Francisco Police Department and confirmed that this case was real and unsolved. Patricia's brother, Daniel Mendez, had indeed vanished under circumstances very similar to what happened to Marcus, David, and James. The SFPD detective who'd worked the case was retired but agreed to speak with me. He said the Mendez disappearance had haunted him throughout his career. Every rational explanation had been examined and eliminated. Daniel had entered a room and ceased to exist, as impossible as that sounded. The detective had eventually concluded that something about the security footage had to be wrong, that there must have been a longer period where the camera wasn't recording than the timestamp indicated. But technical analysis had found no evidence supporting that theory. This discovery led us to search for other similar cases. We found 4 more over a 15-year period, all on the West Coast, all involving people who disappeared from enclosed spaces under video surveillance. The details varied, but the core impossibility was consistent. People entering spaces with one exit and never emerging, despite cameras covering the exit continuously. None of these cases had been connected before because they'd occurred in different jurisdictions and were separated by years. But when you laid them out together, a pattern emerged. In each case, the person who disappeared had been alone or in a small group. In each case, the location was an unremarkable commercial or industrial space. In each case, there were brief electromagnetic anomalies recorded just before the disappearance. And in several cases, when investigators looked closely, they found strange symbols scratched or drawn on walls or floors, geometric patterns that matched symbols from various mystical traditions related to thresholds and doorways. Agent Torres assembled all these cases into a single database and brought in Dr. Vasquez again to review the patterns. She studied the locations on a map, looking for any geographical correlation. The disappearances were scattered along the West Coast from San Diego to Seattle, with no obvious clustering. She examined the dates, looking for temporal patterns, nothing significant. The electromagnetic anomalies were consistent across cases but didn't point to any specific cause. What did interest her were the symbols. In every case where symbols had been found, they were variations on the same geometric themes, intersecting lines forming specific angles, circles within circles, patterns that Dr. Vasquez said corresponded to mathematical descriptions of higher dimensional geometry. Someone in each case had marked the location, either knowing or believing that it was a dimensional thin point. Whether the symbols themselves did anything or were just markers indicating where a natural phenomenon occurred, Dr. Vasquez couldn't say, but their consistent presence across multiple cases suggested they meant something. We began investigating whether there was a community or network of people searching for these dimensional doorways. James's online activity showed he'd participated in forums and chat groups dedicated to consciousness, exploration, and alternative theories of reality. We went through his posting history and identified other users he'd interacted with regularly. Several of them had also posted about searching for thin points and trying to map locations where dimensional barriers might be weak. We tracked down and interviewed 5 of these individuals. All confirmed that there was an informal network of people, mostly psychedelic users and spiritual seekers, who believed that doorways to other dimensions existed and could be found if you knew what to look for. They shared information about locations, techniques for detecting anomalies, and theories about how to potentially cross through if you found a genuine doorway. Most of them viewed it as a spiritual quest or interesting intellectual exercise, but a few, like James, seemed to take it completely seriously as a practical goal. One man we interviewed, a former engineer named Robert Cross, had developed instrumentation specifically designed to detect what he called dimensional instabilities. He'd been searching for thin points for over a decade and claimed to have found several locations with unusual properties, but he'd never tried to cross through because he feared he wouldn't be able to return. I asked Robert if he'd ever heard of the Route 47 gas station or knew whether James had shared information about that location online. Robert said James had posted about finding a promising site but had been deliberately vague about its exact location. He'd said he wanted to investigate further before sharing details with the community. That suggested James had been planning what happened for weeks or possibly months before the actual disappearance. He'd found what he believed was a dimensional doorway. He'd gotten a job at the location to study it, and then, for reasons we still didn't understand, he'd convinced Marcus and David to join him in whatever experiment or attempt he'd planned for that night. Why had James involved the other 2 men? This question bothered me throughout the investigation. If James believed he'd found a way to cross into another dimension, why not go alone? Why risk bringing co-workers who might not understand or believe what he was attempting? The answer, I eventually realized, might be in something Dr. Vasquez had mentioned earlier. She'd said that consciousness might affect quantum systems. If that were true, perhaps multiple conscious minds working together could amplify the effect. Perhaps James needed the other men there not just as witnesses but as participants whose combined consciousness could strengthen whatever phenomenon he was trying to trigger. We found evidence supporting this theory in James's journal. One entry from a month before the disappearance discussed the concept of group consciousness and how multiple minds focused on the same intention might be able to affect reality in ways a single mind couldn't. James had written about shamanic traditions where groups would gather to journey together to other realms, how the collective energy of the group made the experience more powerful and more likely to succeed. He'd apparently decided that crossing a dimensional threshold would require more than just himself. He'd need others with him, focused on the same goal. But how had he convinced Marcus and David to participate? Marcus was a skeptical, practical man, focused on supporting his family. David was creative and open-minded, but not someone who'd risk his life based on another person's strange theories. What had James told them that night to get them to enter that storage room with him? We reviewed the security footage again and again, watching the body language of the three men during their conversations earlier in the shift. James had been animated, clearly explaining something at length. Marcus had been skeptical but willing to listen. David had been curious and engaged. By the time they'd all entered the storage room together, none of them had shown signs of fear or reluctance. Whatever James had told them, they'd gone along with it willingly. My best guess, supported by the psychological profiles we'd developed, was that James had framed it as a harmless experiment. He'd probably told them he'd found something interesting in the storage room, maybe some kind of optical illusion or unusual electromagnetic phenomenon. He'd invited them to see it, to experience it themselves. Marcus and David, with a few hours to kill on a slow night shift, had been curious enough to agree. They'd had no idea they were walking into a situation from which they might not return. This made James's actions particularly troubling from an ethical standpoint. If he'd genuinely believed he was crossing into another dimension, he'd deliberately brought two other people along without fully informed consent. They'd thought they were looking at something strange during a boring overnight shift. Instead, they'd been pulled into an event that had removed them from everything they knew. Their families had been left without answers, without closure, without even bodies to bury. Marcus's daughters would grow up without their father. David's music would never be heard by more than the few thousand people who'd already discovered it. James himself had left no one behind who mourned him deeply, but that didn't excuse what he'd done to the others. As the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, we had to face the reality that the case might never be solved through conventional investigative methods. Agent Torres prepared a comprehensive report for FBI headquarters detailing everything we'd discovered and concluding that the disappearance involved phenomena beyond current scientific understanding. The report was received skeptically by his superiors, as you might imagine. Several senior agents suggested that we'd somehow missed an obvious explanation and had allowed ourselves to be drawn into pseudo-scientific speculation. Torres defended his conclusions vigorously, pointing out that we'd eliminated every conventional explanation through thorough investigation. What remained, however impossible it seemed, had to be considered. The FBI officially classified the case as unsolved and inactive, though Torres kept the file open and continued to monitor for any new information. The families held a memorial service on the one-year anniversary, October 18, 2020. I attended along with Agent Torres and several other investigators who'd worked the case. It was a strange service because we were mourning people who might not actually be dead. They were just gone, removed from our reality in a way that left their status permanently ambiguous. Teresa Reed spoke briefly, talking about Marcus and what he'd meant to their family. She said she'd accepted that she'd probably never know what happened to her husband, but she'd chosen to believe he was at peace somewhere. It was the only way she could move forward with her life and help their daughters do the same. David's parents had flown in from Korea and spoke through a translator about their son's creative spirit and his constant search for meaning and beauty in the world. They said they hoped he'd found what he was looking for, whatever that might have been. No one spoke for James because no one had come to mourn him. His ex-girlfriend attended but stayed in the back and left immediately after the service ended. James had been the catalyst for whatever happened that night, but he'd apparently lived his life in a way that left him unmissed when he vanished. After the service, Dr. Vasquez approached me and asked if I'd be willing to visit the gas station with her one more time. She wanted to take new measurements with improved equipment she'd developed over the past year. I agreed, more out of personal curiosity than any hope of breakthrough. We went that evening, after dark, roughly the same time that the disappearance had occurred a year earlier. Dr. Vasquez set up her instruments in the storage room while I watched. The room looked exactly as it had a year ago. The gas station's new owner had changed nothing, perhaps out of respect for what had happened, or perhaps because he didn't know what to change. The location was an unremarkable commercial or industrial space. In each case, there were brief electromagnetic anomalies recorded just before the disappearance. And in several cases, when investigators looked closely, they found strange symbols scratched or drawn on walls or floors, geometric patterns that matched symbols from various mystical traditions related to thresholds and doorways. Agent Torres assembled all these cases into a single database and brought in Dr. Vasquez again to review the patterns. She studied the locations on a map, looking for any geographical correlation. The disappearances were scattered along the west coast from San Diego to Seattle with no obvious clustering. She examined the dates, looking for temporal patterns, nothing significant. The electromagnetic anomalies were consistent across cases, but didn't point to any specific cause. What did interest her were the symbols. In every case where symbols had been found, they were variations on the same geometric themes. Intersecting lines forming specific angles, circles within circles, patterns that Dr. Vasquez said corresponded to mathematical descriptions of higher dimensional geometry. Someone in each case had marked the location, either knowing or believing that it was a dimensional thin point. Whether the symbols themselves did anything or were just markers indicating where a natural phenomenon occurred, Dr. Vasquez couldn't say. But their consistent presence across multiple cases suggested they meant something. We began investigating whether there was a community or network of people searching for these dimensional doorways. James's online activity showed he'd participated in forums and chat groups dedicated to consciousness exploration and alternative theories of reality. We went through his posting history and identified other users he'd interacted with regularly. Several of them had also posted about searching for thin points and trying to map locations where dimensional barriers might be weak. We tracked down and interviewed 5 of these individuals. All confirmed that there was an informal network of people, mostly psychedelic users and spiritual seekers, who believed that doorways to other dimensions existed and could be found if you knew what to look for. They shared information about locations, techniques for detecting anomalies, and theories about how to potentially cross through if you found a genuine doorway. Most of them viewed it as a spiritual quest or interesting intellectual exercise, but a few, like James, seemed to take it completely seriously as a practical goal. One man we interviewed, a former engineer named Robert Cross, had developed instrumentation specifically designed to detect what he called dimensional instabilities. He'd been searching for thin points for over a decade and claimed to have found several locations with unusual properties, but he'd never tried to cross through because he feared he wouldn't be able to return. I asked Robert if he'd ever heard of the Route 47 gas station or knew whether James had shared information about that location online. Robert said James had posted about finding a promising site but had been deliberately vague about its exact location. He'd said he wanted to investigate further before sharing details with the community. That suggested James had been planning what happened for weeks or possibly months before the actual disappearance. He'd found what he believed was a dimensional doorway. He'd gotten a job at the location to study it. And then, for reasons we still didn't understand, he'd convinced Marcus and David to join him in whatever experiment or attempt he'd planned for that night. Why had James involved the other 2 men? This question bothered me throughout the investigation. If James believed he'd found a way to cross into another dimension, why not go alone? Why risk bringing co-workers who might not understand or believe what he was attempting? The answer, I eventually realized, might be in something Dr. Vasquez had mentioned earlier. She'd said that consciousness might affect quantum systems. If that were true, perhaps multiple conscious minds working together could amplify the effect. Perhaps James needed the other men there, not just as witnesses but as participants. whose combined consciousness could strengthen whatever phenomenon he was trying to trigger. We found evidence supporting this theory in James's journal. One entry from a month before the disappearance discussed the concept of group consciousness and how multiple minds focused on the same intention might be able to affect reality in ways a single mind couldn't. James had written about shamanic traditions where groups would gather to journey together to other realms, how the collective energy of the group made the experience more powerful and more likely to succeed. He'd apparently decided that crossing a dimensional threshold would require more than just himself. He'd need others with him, focused on the same goal. But how had he convinced Marcus and David to participate? Marcus was a skeptical, practical man focused on supporting his family. David was creative and open-minded, but not someone who'd risk his life based on another person's strange theories. What had James told them that night to get them to enter that storage room with him? We reviewed the security footage again and again, watching the body language of the three men during their conversations earlier in the shift. James had been animated, clearly explaining something at length. Marcus had been skeptical but willing to listen. David had been curious and engaged. By the time they'd all entered the storage room together, none of them had shown signs of fear or reluctance. Whatever James had told them, they'd gone along with it willingly. My best guess, supported by the psychological profiles we'd developed, was that James had framed it as a harmless experiment. He'd probably told them he'd found something interesting in the storage room, maybe some kind of optical illusion or unusual electromagnetic phenomenon. He'd invited them to see it, to experience it themselves. Marcus and David, with a few hours to kill on a slow night shift, had been curious enough to agree. They'd had no idea they were walking into a situation from which they might not return. This made James's actions particularly troubling from an ethical standpoint. If he'd genuinely believed he was crossing into another dimension, he'd deliberately brought two other people along without fully informed consent. They'd thought they were looking at something strange during a boring overnight shift. Instead, they'd been pulled into an event that had removed them from everything they knew. Their families had been left without answers, without closure, without even bodies to bury. Marcus's daughters would grow up without their father. David's music would never be heard by more than the few thousand people who'd already discovered it. James himself had left no one behind who mourned him deeply, but that didn't excuse what he'd done to the others. As the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, we had to face the reality that the case might never be solved through conventional investigative methods. Agent Torres prepared a comprehensive report for FBI headquarters detailing everything we'd discovered and concluding that the disappearance involved phenomena beyond current scientific understanding. The report was received skeptically by his superiors, as you might imagine. Several senior agents suggested that we'd somehow missed an obvious explanation and had allowed ourselves to be drawn into pseudo-scientific speculation. Torres defended his conclusions vigorously, pointing out that we'd eliminated every conventional explanation through thorough investigation. What remained, however impossible it seemed, had to be considered. The FBI officially classified the case as unsolved and inactive, though Torres kept the file open and continued to monitor for any new information. The families held a memorial service on the one-year anniversary, October 18, 2020. I attended along with Agent Torres and several other investigators who'd worked the case. It was a strange service because we were mourning people who might not actually be dead. They were just gone, removed from our reality in a way that left their status permanently ambiguous. Teresa Reed spoke briefly, talking about Marcus and what he'd meant to their family. She said she'd accepted that she'd probably never know what happened to her husband, but she'd chosen to believe he was at peace somewhere. It was the only way she could move forward with her life and help their daughters do the same. David's parents had flown in from Korea and spoke through a translator about their son's creative spirit and his constant search for meaning and beauty in the world. They said they hoped he'd found what he was looking for, whatever that might have been. No one spoke for James because no one had come to mourn him. His ex-girlfriend attended but stayed in the back and left immediately after the service ended. James had been the catalyst for whatever happened that night, but he'd apparently lived his life in a way that left him unmissed when he vanished. After the service, Dr. Vasquez approached me and asked if I'd be willing to visit the gas station with her one more time. She wanted to take new measurements with improved equipment she'd developed over the past year. I agreed, more out of personal curiosity than any hope of breakthrough. We went that evening, after dark, roughly the same time that the disappearance had occurred a year earlier. Dr. Vasquez set up her instruments in the storage room while I watched. The room looked exactly as it had a year ago. The gas station's new owner had changed nothing, perhaps out of respect for what had happened, or perhaps because he didn't know what to change. End of part 3. Dr. Vasquez's equipment hummed and beeped as it took readings of electromagnetic fields, gravitational variations, and other measurements I didn't fully understand. She moved around the room methodically, paying special attention to the area near the wall where James had reached, where the symbols were still faintly visible. After about 90 minutes, she sat down on a box and reviewed her data on a laptop. Her expression was troubled. I asked if she'd found anything. She said the readings were slightly anomalous, nothing dramatic but measurably different from what normal space should show. There were tiny fluctuations in the gravitational field, variations so small they'd be meaningless in most contexts. But they were there, and they suggested that the geometry of space in this room wasn't quite uniform. Dr. Vasquez explained it like this. Imagine a sheet of paper representing our three-dimensional space. Normally the paper is flat and smooth, but if there's a higher dimension adjacent to it, and if the boundary between our space and that higher dimension is thin in some location, the paper might show a very slight curve or dimple. That's what her instruments were detecting. A subtle warping of space that suggested something beyond our normal 3 dimensions was very close by in this location. I asked if this meant the dimensional doorway or whatever it was still existed. Dr. Vasquez said it was more accurate to say that this location had properties that might allow a doorway to form under the right conditions. Whatever James had done that night, whatever combination of factors had aligned, it had apparently allowed the barrier to become temporarily permeable. But that permeability hadn't been permanent. The measurements suggested space had largely stabilized again, though traces of the event remained. Could it happen again? I asked. Dr. Vasquez considered the question carefully before answering. She said that if someone knew exactly what conditions were required, if they understood the mechanism that had allowed the transition, then theoretically, yes, it might be possible to recreate the event. But we didn't know what those conditions were. James might have known, or thought he knew, but he'd taken that knowledge with him when he vanished. We were left with evidence that something extraordinary had occurred, but no understanding of how to reproduce it or control it. This was frustrating, but also perhaps for the best. If people could reliably cross between dimensions, if the technique became known and accessible, the implications would be staggering and potentially catastrophic. People might vanish in large numbers, chasing the promise of other worlds, or something from another dimension might cross through into ours. The boundary between realities, Dr. Vasquez said, might exist for good reason. Breaking through it might unleash consequences we couldn't predict or control. We left the gas station that night with more questions than answers, which had been the theme of the entire investigation. As I drove home, I found myself thinking about Marcus, David, and James, and where they might be. If Dr. Vasquez's theories were correct, they were alive somewhere in a reality adjacent to ours but fundamentally inaccessible. They might be experiencing a world very similar to ours or completely alien. They might be trying to find their way back or might have accepted their new existence and moved on. We would probably never know. The case remained officially unsolved, and I eventually had to move on to other investigations. But I never forgot the Route 47 disappearance. It changed how I thought about reality and what was possible. I'd spent my career believing that every mystery had a solution if you investigated thoroughly enough. This case taught me that some mysteries might be genuinely insoluble, not because of lack of effort or skill, but because they involve aspects of reality that we don't yet have the tools or concepts to fully understand. Over the following years, I kept in touch with Agent Torres and Dr. Vasquez. Torres reported 3 more similar disappearances that occurred in the western United States, all following the same pattern. Enclosed spaces, single exits, continuous video surveillance, and people who entered and never left. Each time, electromagnetic anomalies were recorded. Each time, strange symbols were found marked on walls or floors. The pattern was undeniable now. Something was happening at these locations, something that allowed people to slip out of our dimension into adjacent ones. Dr. Vasquez published a paper in a physics journal outlining a theoretical framework for dimensional transitions. The paper was highly speculative and received mixed reviews from the scientific community. Most physicists considered it an interesting thought experiment, but lacking in testable predictions or experimental verification. A few took it more seriously, recognizing that the cases Dr. Vasquez cited represented genuine anomalies that deserved investigation, even if the proposed explanation seemed far-fetched. The paper didn't mention the specific cases by name, protecting the privacy of the families involved, but it laid out the evidence for localized dimensional instabilities and proposed mechanisms by which conscious beings might transition between dimensional spaces. In 2022, 3 years after the disappearance, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from a man who identified himself as Robert Cross, the engineer I'd interviewed years earlier about the community searching for dimensional thin points. Robert said he had information about the Route 47 case that I needed to hear. We met at a coffee shop, and Robert looked like he'd aged considerably since our last conversation. He told me he'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer and had maybe 6 months left. He wanted to clear his conscience about something before he died. Robert explained that he'd been in contact with James Whitmore in the months before the disappearance, more extensively than he'd admitted during our original interview. James had shared detailed information about the gas station location, including measurements and observations that suggested it was a genuine thin point with unusual properties. Robert had encouraged James to investigate further, but had warned him about attempting to cross through. Robert believed, based on his research, that crossing into another dimension might be a one-way trip. The physics that allowed someone to slip from our dimension into another might not work in reverse. You couldn't count on being able to come back. James had apparently decided the risk was acceptable. He'd told Robert that he felt trapped in this world, that he didn't fit here and never had. His psychedelic experiences had shown him glimpses of other realities that felt more real and more like home than anything in his ordinary life. If he found a genuine doorway, he was going through it, regardless of whether he could return. Robert said he'd tried to talk James out of it, but James had been determined. What Robert felt guilty about was that he'd never warned anyone about what James was planning. He'd known James was going to attempt a crossing, but he'd kept that information private. If he'd contacted police or James's employer, maybe the 2 other men wouldn't have been pulled into James's experiment. Maybe they'd still be here with their families. I asked Robert why he'd kept silent. He said he'd convinced himself it was James's choice to make, that interfering would be a violation of James's autonomy. But the truth was that Robert had been curious. He'd wanted to know if James would succeed, if a genuine crossing was possible. He'd prioritized his curiosity over the safety of people he didn't know. Now, dying and facing the end of his own existence, Robert was consumed with guilt about that decision. I didn't know what to tell him. His information didn't change the facts of the case or bring the missing men back. It just confirmed what we'd already suspected, that James had planned the event and had brought the others into it without fully explaining the risks. Robert died 4 months after our conversation. He'd prepared a document detailing everything he knew about dimensional thin points, the community of searchers, and the specific techniques James had believed would trigger a crossing. He left instructions that this document be delivered to Dr. Vasquez after his death, hoping it might contribute to scientific understanding, even if it couldn't help the people who'd already vanished. Dr. Vasquez received the document and found it fascinating. Robert had compiled decades of observations and measurements from locations around the world. His data showed that thin points, if they existed, were rare but not unique. They seemed to occur in places with unusual geological features, strong electromagnetic fields, or particular geometric configurations of space. Robert had developed mathematical models attempting to predict where thin points might be found, similar to what Dr. Torres had attempted years earlier. What made Robert's work valuable was his engineering background. He'd approached the problem practically, building instruments and taking systematic measurements rather than relying on intuition or mystical experiences. His data had real scientific value even if his conclusions were speculative. Dr. Vasquez used Robert's data to refine her own theoretical models and began working with a team of physicists to design experiments that might detect dimensional thin points if they existed. The work was slow and faced significant skepticism from the broader scientific community, but it was progressing. Perhaps someday, decades from now, we'll have the technology and understanding to detect these thin points reliably, to study them safely, maybe even to control them. If that happens, maybe we'll be able to search for Marcus, David, and James in whatever dimensional space they ended up in. Maybe we'll be able to bring them home or at least determine conclusively what happened to them. But I won't live to see that day. I'm 63 years old now, 5 years past the Route 47 disappearance. I'm planning to retire next year and spend time with my grandchildren, trying to enjoy the years I have left. The case will remain in the files, unsolved officially, but understood by those of us who investigated it. 3 men walked into a storage room and crossed a boundary that shouldn't exist, leaving our reality for something adjacent to it but forever beyond our reach. Sometimes, late at night, I think about them and wonder what they're experiencing. Is it similar to our world or completely alien? Are they together, or did they end up in different dimensional spaces? Do they remember us and the lives they left behind, or has their transition changed them in ways that make their old existence feel like a distant dream? I think about Teresa Reed and her daughters, about David's parents, about all the people who loved the missing men and never got closure. I think about how inadequate our investigation must seem to them, how we spent months pursuing a mystery only to conclude that their loved ones had fallen through a crack in reality that we couldn't explain or fix. And I think about James Whitmore, the man who orchestrated the event, who believed so strongly in the existence of other dimensions that he literally stepped out of ours to find them. Was he right? Did he find what he was looking for? Is he happier in whatever world he ended up in than he was here? Or does he regret his decision and wish desperately for a way back that doesn't exist? These questions have no answers, at least not ones I'll ever know. The Route 47 disappearance remains one of those rare cases where the evidence points clearly to something, but we lack the framework to fully understand what that something is. We know 3 men vanished from a locked room, we know electromagnetic anomalies occurred, we know the location has unusual spatial properties, we know there's a pattern of similar cases, but we don't know the mechanism, don't understand the physics, can't predict or prevent future occurrences. What I do know is that reality is stranger than we generally acknowledge. We live our lives assuming the world follows predictable rules, that the boundaries of physical law are fixed and unchangeable. But there are cracks in that certainty, places and moments where the rules don't quite apply, where something beyond our normal experience becomes briefly possible. Most people never encounter these cracks. They live and die without ever seeing evidence that reality is more complex than it appears. But some people, through chance or intention or some quality of consciousness we don't understand, find their way to these thin places where dimensions touch, and occasionally some of them cross through, leaving behind only mystery and questions for those of us who remain. The gas station on Route 47 still operates. It has new owners now, people who bought it without knowing its history or didn't care. The storage room is still there, unchanged except for new inventory on the shelves. Nothing marks it as special or unusual. If you walked in there today, you'd see an ordinary storage room in an ordinary gas station. You'd never guess that 5 years ago, 3 men stood in that exact space and then ceased to exist in our world. The scratches on the wall have been painted over. The electromagnetic anomalies have faded. The dimensional boundary, if that's what it was, has stabilized. But the possibility remains. Somewhere in that room, in dimensions perpendicular to the ones we perceive, there might still be a thin place. Under the right conditions, with the right combination of factors we don't fully understand, it might become permeable again. Someone else might find it. Someone else might cross through, and we'd be left with another impossible disappearance, another case file documenting something we can observe but can't explain. That's the legacy of the Route 47 case. Not answers, but questions. Not solutions, but mysteries. Not closure, but an opening onto possibilities that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of reality. For the families of Marcus Reed, David Cho, and James Whitmore, I hope someday there will be answers. I hope that future science will develop the tools to find them, or at least to understand definitively what happened to them. I hope their story contributes somehow to human knowledge, that their disappearance wasn't meaningless suffering, but but part of humanity's larger journey toward understanding the true complexity of existence. And for anyone reading this account, anyone who thinks about attempting what James attempted, searching for dimensional doorways and trying to cross through, I offer this warning. The boundary between dimensions might exist for important reasons. Breaking through it might take you somewhere you can never return from. The grass might not be greener in other realities. You might find yourself trapped, alone, separated forever from everyone you knew and everything familiar. James Whitmore believed he'd found something better on the other side. He convinced 2 other men to come with him, men who left behind families and futures and lives they might have lived for decades more. We don't know if James was right about what waited on the other side. We don't know if any of them found what they were looking for, or if they regret every day the decision that removed them from our world. That uncertainty should give pause to anyone tempted to follow in their footsteps. But I know it won't. As long as humans exist, some of us will be drawn to mysteries and thin places, to boundaries we're not supposed to cross, and knowledge we're not supposed to have. Someone else will find a dimensional thin point. Someone else will wonder what's on the other side. Someone else will step through. And those of us left behind will be left to wonder and investigate and ultimately accept that some questions can't be answered from this side of the boundary. The Route 47 disappearance taught me that. It taught me humility about the limits of human knowledge and human investigation. It taught me that reality is vast and strange and full of possibilities we can barely imagine. And it taught me that sometimes the bravest and most terrifying thing you can do is admit that you don't know, that you can't know, that the answer exists somewhere beyond your reach. 3 men walked into a storage room on a quiet night in October 2019. They never walked out, that's all I know for certain. Everything else is theory, speculation, and hope that someday someone will understand what we could not.